Some films were harmed in the making of this podcast. From Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, and the palatial FYC studio, you're listening to For Your Consideration,
the podcast featuring roundtable discussion reevaluating the cinematic canon of past masterpieces and modern classics.
I'm your host, Mike Josick.
And I'm Dustin Friesenan.
And we'd like to put out a hearty hello to all our listeners who are catching the show on YouTube, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, Google Play, and all great podcast providers. And just a note that if you're catching the show off of iTunes, streaming or downloading, while you're there, we would super appreciate it if you rated and reviewed the show, because it is the most quantifiable way to get the show into the eyes and ears of potential listeners. It affects the search algorithms. The more ratings and reviews that you have, the more likely it is you're to pop up when somebody searches your genre or topic. So there you go. Good way to support the show.
If we get carpet bombed with reviews, that is how you will win our hearts and minds.
Absolutely.
It worked in Iraq, it'll work again.
If you're a frequent listener of the podcast, thanks for joining us again. And if you are new to the show, be warned, spoilers ahead. So as we mentioned on last week's show, this week we are covering the 1991 Gus Van Sant indie classic, My Own Private Idaho.
A.k.a. that film about sleeping with other people, in every sense of the word, as much as possible. Narcolepsy will do that to you.
Until you said that, I didn't catch that.
Which is why I added that in.
You saw my face. So before we get to the conversation about the film this week, I just wanted to address something that Dustin and I started up post-Vertigo. We've often said we wanted to know what you guys think, and so what we're going to be doing now on social media is on Twitter and on Facebook, after we make our final judgment on a movie, whether it's a masterpiece, a museum piece, or it's a split decision, we want you guys to hit our social media. There will be a Facebook post, there will be a Twitter post where you can like, retweet, whatever the instruction is, and that will be basically you putting your vote in for whether you think it's a masterpiece or a museum piece, and then...
Or perhaps a movie that should just be shot out of a cannon into the sun.
Which, in that case, I would say hit the comment section. But that's something that we're doing now. We did that for Vertigo. We didn't really announce that we were doing it, so we didn't get a really strong response to it. But as it is, we did get some response on Twitter and on Facebook, and I'm somewhat surprised to say it was a 50-50 split. So while Dustin and I both voted absolutely not for Vertigo, you guys, half of you think masterpiece, half of you think museum piece. And that's what we'll do as episodes go on. Post it on the social media, and then the following week, on the following episode, we will announce, prior to talking about the new movie, what you guys thought about the last movie.
And I hope to have a few of you show up on YouTube, on Libsyn, on wherever, to let us know why you thought it was a masterpiece, because I'm curious, for one.
Yeah, whatever you vote, feel free to comment. Feel free to expand on those thoughts. We will not discourage that.
Not at all.
So with that out of the way, let's get into the credits for My Own Private Idaho. It's a 1991 film directed by Gus Van Sant, produced by Laurie Parker, written by Gus Van Sant. It starred River Phoenix and Keanu Reeves. Music was by Bill Stafford. Cinematography by John J. Campbell and Eric Allen Edwards. It was edited by Curtis Clayton, distributed by Fine Line Features, and it got a wide release in the U.S. on September 29th, 1991. The film is very well regarded by critics.
It also places 588th on the critics poll at BFI's Sight and Sound poll of greatest movies of all time, as well as 546th on the directors poll.
And just to qualify, as we like to do when we can, the edition that we watched was the 2-disc Criterion edition, spine number 277.
That's about as precise as you're going to get.
So I believe this was the first time for both Dustin and me. Dustin, what did you think of My Own Private Idaho?
Dustin and I believe you're supposed to be the editor here. I actually felt fairly bored with my Own Private Idaho. I had a really hard time caring about much of what was going on. You have the story of the sort of runaways, the vagrants that are effectively hanging out on the streets, being escorts, and...
Well, they're street hustlers. They're male prostitutes.
I thought hustler had a more wide meaning than that.
They are rent boys.
And to be fair, they're also involved in robbing people. They're just on the streets doing what they can in order to survive.
Yeah.
And while some, like Keanu Reeves, don't need to go gay for pay, and may or may not mock Mike for doing so, they're still out there doing what they kind of have to do. Mike, oddly enough, has narcolepsy, so he's falling asleep randomly at all times, usually when stressed. I didn't actually get around to researching what actually causes it, but I somehow feel as though it's not entirely accurate. I feel as though
I do know that the character is based on someone that Gus Van Sant actually knew. So I think there's...
It is based on someone that he knew, but he got the idea for narcolepsy just because somebody kept falling asleep during editing or filming or something like that. That's the story that I read.
Oh, he actually knows somebody with narcolepsy. The character of Mike is a composite of two people. One is an actual person who is a street hustler, and the other was another friend of his, someone that he knew, who had narcolepsy, and he combined the two.
And now I know.
And now you know.
And it seems that narcolepsy...
So I'm assuming that there's some accuracy to the portrayal of the cause of narcolepsy. I know that the portrayal of the actual narcolepsy fit itself should be quite accurate because, according to Gus, he said that River was pretty much doing it exactly the way it looked like when his friend would suffer from them.
But it also seemed to happen generally at specific times that would just advance the plot in a certain way.
I think you're right about the stress. Like, I think it is a chemical imbalance caused by stress. And we got called out for research regarding our French Connection episode just a few days ago. But not having done the research...
I'm repeating it. I did not look it up at all.
Neither of us have looked this up other than just what I know from the making of the film and what Gus Van Sant and River Phoenix have said about it. So, yeah, I think it's a chemical imbalance caused by stress. But then again, he also suffers from it just randomly when he's out on the road.
So it's really hard to tell. The only experience that I've seen with it was actually in canine narcolepsy, and they just fell asleep at random. Either way, this is turning into a really long sidetrack that's mostly going to be edited out, I think. And getting back to it, it seemed to occur at odd times that was really... The first major time that I'd see where it became sort of an issue was with the woman who hired him, Scotty, and their buddy, whose name I forget, because she wanted to have 3 guys. It takes her a while to get started, apparently.
Gary. I think it was Gary. Continue.
And he falls out asleep during that, in spite of the fact that, like, he's hooking up with all sorts of random people. This is his job, his livelihood. Why this would be super stressful would imply that he's not gay for pay, as he says that he's actually gay but hiding it, especially when you add in the campfire scene with Scotty later on where he admits to having feelings for him, but Keanu Reeves just sort of dismisses it and specifically states a man can't love another man. That's just not a thing.
It's actually pretty perceptive of you because the character as written by Gus Van Sant was originally not supposed to be gay. River Phoenix really felt that character needed to go in that direction, and he really wanted to play. That campfire scene was very much ad-libbed, and Gus allowed them to do a lot sort of on the day, and he didn't restrict them to sticking to... the script itself wasn't a rigid script to begin with. So River wanted to take it that way, and Gus was like, okay. And I think that gave an extra layer to the whole character and the arc, because his character genuinely was in love with Scott.
Or at the very least, loved Scott, because these are people who've been abandoned by their families, who have very little connection with the world around them. They have a few people in their lives and odd connections to all of them. Certainly, Scott talks about how he loves Bob more than he loves his own biological father, and goes on about how he's using him in order to, how he's using everybody, basically, in order to have his downfall that he will then rise up from when it comes to inheriting his father's empire. And a quick side note on that, whenever he speaks to Bob, I freaking hate their flowery-ass language, and I know that he initially wrote it as sort of a updated version of Shakespeare's Henry the Fourth and Henry the Fifth, whatever.
Keanu is essentially Prince Hal, and Bob is essentially Falstaff.
I've never read it myself, and I also didn't know about that connection until I was reading up about it afterwards. So when I'm watching the movie, it's just like, this seems like really pretentious indie movie up its own ass bullshit. So it did not fit well as I'm watching the movie. I don't feel that worked.
Fair enough.
Especially since it completely disappears when they leave Bob behind in the first town that they're in. They move to all sorts of different towns, and they're only in Idaho for a very little bit.
They go from Portland to Idaho to Italy, back to Portland.
I thought they went somewhere else after Portland, and they were hoping...
Seattle. I think they were in Seattle briefly.
There you go.
Yeah.
Portland, Seattle, Idaho, Italy, back to Portland, just all over the show. Spending very little time in Idaho. He's just going on about a few of his memories that he has. He'll often dream about being back home and...
Well, it's part of his quest to reconnect with his mother. He's so desperate for home and family and connection. I mean, you mentioned the whole thing about connection, and that's why that road trip is undertaken.
And it's why his professing of love to Scotty is sort of unsure in my head, at least, which is a good way to play it, a fantastic way to play it, because he doesn't, as a male escort, he's got the whole concept of physical affection very much skewed in his own head, as well as a lack of actual proper affection from people and being a discarded person, being sort of a vagrant. How bonds would work within his own mind would be very confused. So love and sex and affection and intimacy.
And then you combine that with the narcolepsy, he's got a great deal of disconnect.
How many people are there for him with the narcolepsy? And certainly when he's come out of it a few times, he's like, well, how much money did you get from selling my body? Mike, I don't do that to you while you're asleep. I'm on your side here, buddy. Until, of course, he abandons everybody completely at the end of the film, which is a real kick in the nuts. When they do finally get to Italy and Scotty abandons him for this random Italian woman that he meets, that is a real kick in the balls to Mike. And then they get back and he then kicks Bob to the curb as well and just completely abandons his old life 100%, leaving everybody to sort of flounder in the gutters, despite saying that he would be there for them at all times.
Well, Scott's whole arc, the whole Prince Hal thing, Prince Hal was in line to essentially succeed his father, who was the king. And before he did so, he went and he lived with the vagrants and ne'er-do-wells. He wasn't a street hustler, but that's essentially the track that Scott is on, where he knows that he's going to be inheriting the money, and he even says, like, he's planning the turnaround and he's going to impress everybody.
And because he was so low, the turnaround will be that much more impressive. It's
very calculated, and I think because it's a choice for him, his experience is so different, and the way that he's interacting, navigating through these relationships, it's so different from Mike and Bob and Gary and everybody else.
It's like common people, and I'm going to go with William Shatner's version here, where one call to your dad and you could stop it all. You'll never understand what it's like, sort of deal.
And I actually liked the Shakespearean stuff. I found out that Gus Van Sant was talking about how Keanu had recently done Shakespeare just prior to doing Point Break, which was the film before this, and this film. So he brought a real theatricality to it. But considering this whole film has a dreamlike quality, it's consistent in its inconsistency.
I thought it was completely consistent.
Well, it's inconsistent in the sense that you go from these very, street level encounters to this theatrical Shakespearean dialogue and posturing, and then it becomes a road movie. And the music, which that crazy like steel guitar and the bow going
I can't remember a single thing about the music except for the Pogues in the end credits.
It's got such a bizarre tone in it. The use of time-lapse photography, the flashbacks, the magazine cover scene, which is something that that
was an odd one.
And they never go back to. That's what I mean by it's inconsistent, but it's consistent in its inconsistency. It never sets itself up so that you go, well, this was supposed to happen, but that didn't happen. You just sort of roll with it because it's not following any typical Hollywood tropes or narrative structure, and it's kind of like a fever dream. It's kind of stream of consciousness, and it sort of exists in its own space, and I really like that about the movie.
Going back to that magazine cover scene, like, I'd completely forgotten about it until you just mentioned it. Like I said, this movie has had very little effect on me. It's already drifting from my mind, and I just saw it earlier today. But with the knowledge of it being sort of 2 stories that Gus Van Sant wrote and put together, 3 stories. All right, it's a bit of a cluster then. But with one of them being Shakespearean and Keanu being the person in the magazine scene, that feels very much like a soliloquy in a Shakespearean play.
Mm-hmm.
So if anything feels out of place, yeah, it's Keanu and his character. And I don't necessarily see it as a story of 2 different stories, his and Mike's, and the paths that they're on. I see him as a side character in Mike's story, and the effect that he's had on Mike during this part of his life. And when I think of slice of life sort of films like this one, I expect it to bounce here and there and all over because that's what life is. It doesn't have a consistent tone. Day by day, your life will change. And that is what happens in this film. And going back to some odd imagery, the scene where it was Scotty and Mike and the German guy, and
Udo Kier,
and they're having sex, and it was just a bunch of still shots, which were not so much still shots as them posing for a second.
The same camera. With the Italian girl.
I didn't recognize it as them having sex until it happened again with the Italian girl, because prior to that I was like, so is he just photographing them? I get it. He's posing them, and they're all just posing for these pictures for him. Okay, that's interesting, because they go through a couple other odd fetishes that people have. The guy who loved the scrubbing.
The Dutch boy.
The cleaning. As the lucky 44th Dutch boy, you get to scrub me. So yeah, they go through fetishes, and it's like, oh, here's a guy who wants to photograph stuff. And it wasn't until Keanu's posing with the girl that I was like, oh, wait a second. No, they're being artsy about the sex scene. I gotcha.
But you know what's interesting about that, too, is that this also feeds into the inconsistency of it. There's the scene right at the beginning of the movie where River is getting a blowjob from a client, from a date, and it's not done in that style. It's done in a very in-your-face, kind of intimate. Not, I mean, you're on River's face getting his reactions. It's not, it's not, super perverse or anything.
Until they then have the cum shot with, what was it, a building exploding?
A barn dropping.
A barn dropping.
On a highway, which...
It all felt very, okay, here's indie film. I'm trying to use metaphors here. So it all just felt a little up its own arse to me when it came to some of that kind of stuff. And usually that I just slough off and ignore. Especially since, as you said, it's inconsistent in its use. So it becomes less of, here's the method that they're using, and it's now they're just trying something different and forgotten and on to the next thing.
But I also think I noticed that the second half of the film has a little bit more drive to it. You could say that's just because maybe the first half is just sort of setting up characters. I mean, in the first half, you also get virtually some documentary footage because there's the 2 street hustlers that Gus is interviewing in the diner about their experiences, which it kind of stands out, but it also kind of completely blends in. I mean, they're talking to somebody. You instantly feel like they're talking to the director, and they're telling the stories of their first dates.
Yeah, they're explaining just how, life on the streets kind of sucks in a way that you're not being shown, you're being told, but it felt very, very much real.
And I just think that, there's less of a sense of drive or purpose in the character of Mike because he doesn't really, he's just drifting. And then once he decides to do the road trip, once he decides to go to Idaho and then finds out he has to go to Italy and he sort of gets swept up in this thing, that's kind of where the narrative drive comes in a little more strongly. You sort of get your, I hesitate to call it closure, but I mean, you kind of see the way that the end of Scott's arc affects kind of everybody else. And Mike just ends up back in Portland, back on the street,
Being picked up by some random person in the middle of the road.
Doing the thing that he's always done.
And certainly that ending, even though it says, have a nice day. Mike is picked up while unconscious by a random motorist, so you don't know what's happening. That could be a serial killer. That could be someone bringing him to a...
That broke my heart when that truck stopped and those guys just took his shoes and his bag. I was like, poor Mike.
Those were some nice shoes, too, I saw when they were...
I thought so, too. But it was just, considering everything this guy has gone through throughout this movie, and then to just get robbed while he's sleeping on the highway. Oh, by the way, I did a quick Google a few minutes ago, and narcoleptic fits are often brought about by strong feelings. So not necessarily stress, but strong feelings, which would make sense if he's having those moments on the highway where he's talking about.
And it would make sense for all the scenes that I said. You start building towards something and then he falls asleep, creating some sort of weird false drama. No, if that's how it goes, then that would just suck.
It's a terrible thing to have in the field of work that he's in. But I also like the way it fed into the story. I mean, it was an interesting character thing, but to have him to transition where he's on a plane and it's like, excuse me, sir, we're in Portland, and he's like, oh, yeah.
How do you get a guy who's passed out onto a plane?
Well, I mean,
oh no, don't worry about it. I'll just carry my buddy on here. Don't worry about it. He's just a little asleep.
Got onto the plane before he passed out, but
obviously, I don't feel it's that obvious.
Well,
especially
true.
Since he passes out in a different scene in a different context. And usually just ends up waking up somewhere else.
But that just feeds into the whole dreamlike quality of this movie. I mean, it's a very playful narrative. It's a deeply emotional narrative, I think. And, I mean, this movie has no solid, pure, salient reality to it.
It has his reality. And it feels, as I said, quite coherent to me. It follows a very realistic path. When I see a film that, I guess you're saying it has a dreamlike quality, I guess I'm thinking a bit more Shakespearean in that life is a dream.
I went into this movie thinking it was going to be this, mean streets, midnight cowboy, dark street hustler. This is how it is. And it isn't. It's a really strange, oddly kind of mystical, as I keep saying, dreamlike narrative with the strangest music and some really powerful performances, I think, from two actors at the time who River, maybe people would expect River to have made this movie, but Keanu was just coming off Point Break. Keanu...
And Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventures.
Yeah, I mean, Keanu was on a trajectory where this is not where people would have probably expected him to go. But it was also a time where people didn't know Keanu and didn't know that he liked to explore. He liked to try new things, and he was an actor, and he wasn't just teen heartthrob.
And they didn't know that he was a vampire yet who doesn't age. He's 400 now and looks exactly the same with a beard?
I think so. And really, I think this is one of Keanu's best roles.
And you've seen John Wick.
I have seen John Wick. So I don't really know. I think anything else that I want to say, I'm happy to do it in the wrap-up.
Funny enough, this feels like a rather short conversation this time.
It does feel like a weirdly short conversation. I mean...
But as I said, much of the movie just seems fairly forgettable to me. It did not strike much of an emotional chord. You can either think of it as Scotty's last hurrah, the last thing he's going to do before he moves on to his new life, or you could think of it as just a blip in Mike's life. And certainly that's the way that I look at it. That this is just another sort of shitty experience in his life as he's going to and fro. I consider this a slice of life drama, and it's a slice of his life. And his being a street hustler is fairly irrelevant to the overarching plot of him looking for family and community and having his best friend, who claims that Mike is also Scotty's best friend, completely abandon him and screw him over.
His role as being a rent boy, essentially, like you said, it doesn't necessarily affect the narrative drive in terms of what he wants, but it puts him in an environment. It puts him in a setting. It puts him among a cast of characters.
And I think none of that is relevant. The setting that he's in doesn't matter. He's a rent boy, but doesn't stop them from having the money to get a motorcycle, go to whichever town
Well, they
feel
stole
like
the motorcycle.
flying over to
Until... You know what?
Italy.
We need to talk about Udo's cabaret act. With the lamp in the hotel room.
Go right ahead, I guess.
Well, there's a part in the movie where apparently at the time Udo Kier had a cabaret act and they incorporated it into the film when they're in the hotel room and he does the little dance with the lamp. Swear to God, that's going to be my Halloween costume. Turtleneck and a lamp. Do you not remember what I'm talking about? Or
No, I know exactly what you're talking
Okay.
about. And he's singing in German for a bit, and Mike's not impressed, and Scotty thinks it's funny, but eventually notices that Mike is having none of it and stops it and just starts clapping to not upset the German guy before they sell him the stolen bike.
Which leads to, like, just such a great... He's so great on that bike, and he's stroking the gas tank, and the cop pulls him over, and he's, you know why I pulled you over?
And the cop, which also has nothing really much to do with anything else, other than what seems to be the quick joke that Scotty does on Mike, saying that, uh-oh, we're caught, it's a stolen bike, and here's the police, we're out of gas, we can't get it started, better run!
So great when Mike runs off.
And then he passes out because he's freaking out. Which is an amusing little practical joke to play, for sure.
And the cop helps him get the bike started. And then they go and they find out, they go to visit his brother, and they find out that his brother is also his father. There's a whole bunch of weirdness there. And again, it's something that doesn't really play too heavily into the narrative other than to just send them off in another direction. And it's just one more way of showing how Mike just
doesn't have those connections, except for his connection with Scotty, who's going through all this with him, only so that he can be abandoned at the end and end up sort of back at the beginning, where he does end up on that stretch of Idaho road just to get screwed over.
To lose his shoes.
To lose his shoes and get picked up.
I'm glad you had the same sort of thought that I did, because you'd kind of think that after that first truck stops and they steal his stuff, that the other car would stop and it would be somebody who is like, oh man, this guy's having a rough time, I'm going to help him, I'm going to take him to town, whatever. But I had that same thought because Mike just can't really catch a break. And who knows? Who knows what's going to happen to him after that?
Not likely anything good, presumably.
I'd like to think that he gets taken into town.
And it could happen.
And he continues on his way.
He assumed that the German guy was a creepy guy who was a total pervert, but ended up helping him 2-3 times after that.
Gave them a ride to Portland and helped them, bought the motorcycle, which helped them get to Italy.
And Mike was unnecessarily antagonistic to a few people, pre-Scotty and post-Scotty.
I think that was just how Mike rolled.
In my experience with people who do live on the streets, yeah, I honestly don't know. Because my experience with people who are on the wrong side of the law, as it were, is they will be unnecessarily polite to avoid confrontation, or will become extremely standoffish and aggressive to sort of establish, don't mess with me, I will fuck you up.
I think because...
And it can bounce between the two.
I think because of Mike's disconnect, there's that slight antagonism.
And you could also say that it goes away when Scotty's around because he feels more comfortable and more at ease.
Absolutely.
I'm a connoisseur of roads. I've been tasting roads my whole life. This road will never end. It probably goes all around the world. Yeah, but...
But we will let that roll us into the final judgment phase.
Okay, so I know what my private Idaho is. Dustin, what was your private Idaho?
As I said,
Masterpiece or museum piece? I gotta say it.
As I said, this film did not really strike much of an emotional chord with me. It had some interesting parts here and there. I felt that some of the techniques that they did were very just indie film sort of stuff that feels disconnected from anything else they're trying to do, doesn't have that nice consistency, and it doesn't have a good inconsistency, if that makes any sense. And it feels almost a little slapdash together, especially since, as you said, it's 3 stories just sort of put together that were initially supposed to be 3 different stories. And I don't think it all works together very well. But there's enough here to go off of. There's definitely some good performances, some subtle meanings in the whole arc with Mike that would put it into a museum piece. I would put this in the museum. Something worth looking at, but it hasn't even stuck with me 12 hours. It's not going to stick with me for years to come.
I've given this a lot of thought because after watching the movie, just started rolling it around, sorting it out in my head and how I felt about it. I have to say that I do really like it, and I like what it's doing. I like the fact that, as I said, it doesn't have any pure solid reality to it, that it is this playful, dreamlike film with moments of great pathos and comedy and theatricality and strangeness. It can be very kind of avant-garde at times and very straight up at times. I like the fact that this is one of the first mainstream gay films. This is a movie where 2 very bankable straight male actors chose an independent, strange little movie where they were doing something that nowadays, people get high-fived and patted on the bottom for, because, oh, hey, you're bringing attention to this thing and you're representing, and like, this movie predates queer cinema by years. It was not something that was around in 91. Brokeback didn't come till 14 years later. It was a daring film. It was kind of dangerous in that way, I suppose. And it's a tale of love. It's a search for family and home. It's a road movie. I like it. I like it quite a lot. And as far as I'm concerned, My Private Idaho is a masterpiece.
Your My Private Idaho. My Private Idaho. What is the audience's My Private Idaho?
We will be posting on Facebook and Twitter, and feel free to...
And it will be our public Idaho then.
It will be. And we encourage you to check out the Facebook and the Twitter to let us know what you think. We are also on Instagram, and is there another social media outlet that we use? I don't think so.
Instagram, Twitter.
We have a Patreon campaign. If you want to support the show, more than just liking and sharing, subscribing and following on the social media and iTunes, check out the Patreon at patreon.com/FYC show. You can contribute as little as $1 and as much as, I think, like $20. And there's different reward levels and things that you can get. And every little bit helps keep the lights on, helps keeps us developing and evolving the show in new and interesting ways. So feel free to check that out and join the Patreon family and make our lives a little sunnier. We have the blog, the WordPress blog, where we post reviews, articles, and other stuff.
Tie a note to a brick and toss it through a window, and maybe we'll get it.
So that pretty much brings us a close to this week's episode. What are we doing next week, Dustin?
We are doing Jodorowsky's Holy Mountain.
Holy shit. That's my early pre-review of the film.
Jodorowsky is avant-garde, as they like to say. He is an odd one. If you've ever read the Meta Barons, you know what we mean. And if you haven't, check it out if you want to know what it's like to be on acid while sober.
Jodorowsky is avant-garde as fuck.
And this is his weird movie.
It's going to be some craziness. We actually haven't done an avant-garde film in a while.
They thought he was too crazy to do Dune, so they got David Lynch to do it instead. So that's the kind of crazy we're talking about.
Well, didn't Jodorowsky want to do like a 12-hour Dune?
Oh, it was like crazy. 36 hour. He wanted to do
nuts.
miniseries. He wanted something awesome. That would have been fantastic. And what he had became The Metabarons.
Which is really the only reason I'm thrilled that it didn't happen, because the Metabarons is one of those things that has more crazy ideas on one page.
I would much rather see that as a 36-hour miniseries. I want to see that nonsense. If Jodorowsky wasn't 87 right now, I'd say people start giving him money so that he can do this. In fact, do that anyway.
So be sure to check that out a week from now, if we're still sane and with it after watching that show. And until then, I've been your host, Mike.
And I've been Dustin.
We'll see you next time on For Your Consideration.
Take care.
Ciao.
Any friend of Elena's, a good friend of mine. You want to be my friend?
Yeah.
My name is Hans. I'm from Germany. And now I live in America, selling pieces for cars.